Please welcome Jim, Kelly, and Dale to the S4 main stage.
So this is exciting for me because I get to grill the press for a change. So I'm pleased that you're both here, and I do appreciate, we get reporters like the two of you that cover this space to come down, and it's really refreshing because then you don't have to be taught what a PLC is or anything like that. So we do appreciate the reporters that have been covering this beat for many years like yourselves. But I thought the audience, since you have your, a lot of them are your readers and the people that'll watch this video are your readers, I thought we'd maybe get a little bit into how you cover this space. But to kind of ground the audience, Kelly, why don't you start? Who is your reader?
Certainly. So Dark Reading is basically a new cybersecurity news site. Our main reader focus is the cybersecurity professional, so that could be an IT security person or an OT security person. So all levels, from ground level technical people to CISOs. And
Jim?
And Reuters is a wire service. We're one of the biggest news companies in the world. We have 750 TV stations, 1,000 newspapers around the world, and then we have a lot of financial clients. Financial news is a really important aspect of what we do. So cybersecurity, it sort of started out as being part of the general news and financial news beat, and now and was very specialized, and now we have reporters all over the world sort of helping the core cyber team cover the big cyber stories of the day.
So would your reader just be, like my father or something like that, someone who's not in the industry, who doesn't really, who reads the sports section, the life section, and your cyber articles?
So that would be one of our readers, and then the other reader, we have, or two basic sets would be the financial professional. So if there's something going on with, say, Intel chips or this chip story, how's it going to affect Intel, AMD, Oracle, all these companies? Could it, might they have to take charges? What does it mean? Those people are really concerned about that. So we might go down that road where other reporters wouldn't be looking at that so closely.
And I guess maybe this isn't fair because it's probably not just in a newspaper. Most of it's in a website. But what section are you typically in? Are you in business? Are you in technology?
Sure. I mean, I've been doing this with Reuters for covering cyber for about 10 years. Started off, it was on the technology page. Now we're usually, like on the Reuters.com, our stories mostly are on the front page because cyber has become such a big deal.
Oh, okay. Well, that's maybe a good place to jump in here with that as background. People in this industry, we obviously follow your writings very closely, and it seems like a very high percentage of what we read is either a story about a vulnerability that's going to end the world or a story about an attack. Why do you focus almost, in my impression, you focus, not only you, but your peers as well, focus almost entirely on those stories. And I guess I'll let you take the first swing.
Sure. I think those kind of stories tend to be the most popular because they sort of illustrate what the threat can do. We don't write about every vulnerability that's exposed. We try to pick and choose the ones that are more impactful or interesting or unique. But I think the attack stories are still what most readers will read. Obviously, they get more traffic, but that doesn't mean we don't write other types of pieces in the space. But those still tend to be the more popular stories, I would say.
So is it just clicks and other feedback, Jim, that drives you to say, this is what my readers want?
Well, I think it's clicks. I also think it's, but people want to read about things that are going to affect them. And so vulnerabilities, and again, I'm writing for a general and financial audience, but a vulnerability in a device, if it's a medical device, do I need to get my software updated? Could somebody hack into my machine? And there's like, sometimes there's like the fear, right? Like when we started covering the healthcare sector, it was like, is somebody going to go around and start killing people, right? And so it's our job, because that's a real concern, to kind of put in the context and say, well, probably not, but these devices do have vulnerabilities. The companies, the manufacturers, and security professionals are looking at them differently, and it's going to have a big impact. And again, I would say, that area, it's affected the finances. We had, I think it's 2 years ago now, we had St. Jude Medical. There was a very high-profile short sell on that, and people needed to know, could that be done? What are the risks?
Right. But there's this whole class of attack, and I know our area, when you look at general security conferences, the ICS, IIoT area is very popular because it's a physical device. It's like, hey, this new kind of physical device or this new process can be hacked, and I'm sure it gains a lot of readers' interest, but doesn't that sort of make you traffickers in FUD on some of these things? I mean, like if you put something out that certainly raises a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, but really, like the St. Jude thing, they can't do anything about that, right? Why is that such a big story, or was it the financial impact?
Well, St. Jude, I mean, the stock went down, I forget, I think it was like 8% within minutes of that coming out. There were questions as to whether they would be able to actually sell the company to Abbott. So, those were things they were really interested in. They had to understand it. So we have to we have to know all the details and be able to explain it and say, actually, there's been all of these researchers talking about it, but it's never happened, right? And to explain the risk and what the skill that somebody would need to do an attack like that.
Right.
I think, too, just historically, I've been coming to S4 for, I think, 6 years now, we're trying to figure out. I think historically, the stories that I would write from here didn't get a lot of play because nobody was thinking about them yet, right? We have a broad audience, not just ICS SCADA, but I think the interest in those stories has grown as the awareness and the issues have grown and the maturity of the industry has grown. So I feel like my stories probably get more traction now than they did 6 years ago when I was pitching them or writing them. In this space. I was writing about things that a lot of people hadn't thought of yet, or do we need to worry about that yet? Those kind of things. And now we know that we do, and there's real examples to show. We've seen cyber-physical examples. We've seen, Stuxnet, I think, was really the turning point for that. But I feel like now those stories resonate more in general, and there's more awareness, too. So I think it's important to cover them.
And you were out at Black Hat, your company's event, and there were a number of those types of stories, right? So-and-so was able to make this water thing break, or so-and-so was able to affect this nuclear, radiation counter sorts of things. And those not only got covered by your organization, but they seem to get picked up by the whole press and put out. So there certainly is a lot of interest in that. How much longer do you think that's going to happen? How much longer will the readers want to read about the vulnerability du jour for some physical device or some plant or factory?
I don't think the vulnerabilities are going to end. So I think there's going to be more things that we find, more obviously with IoT and IIoT, everything's networked, right? We're going to find more vulnerabilities, more threats. And I think there's more awareness and concern about what do I do about it. So I think those stories are going to continue to be the hot stories. But that's not all we do. We cover those as these are obviously stories that people care about and that are the big news, and they show examples, specific examples of, what if you had this vulnerability, you didn't patch it in your system, this could happen to you. But I think, we try to look at trend stories as well, and, the new technologies that are coming out, the new solutions. I think that's the next level here. We've seen that on IT security. We started out with, here's all the problems, and what do we do to fix it is becoming more of a question. And so that's one of the things we're trying to focus more on. And I think I've been doing some stories along the lines in this space, and I don't know if everyone's excited about them yet, but I think they're important, so I still do them.
Well, and Jim, it's kind of like you were saying, that you did certain things in IT, certainly publications used to cover Microsoft patches. Patch Tuesday, unless it's something very serious, you don't hear much about that anymore in the press. How long do you think that'll be before we start to see that happening in this, where someone says, we found that these elevator control systems can be hacked, and everyone's like, oh yeah, that happens, so I don't want to click on that. How many, are we 3 years, 5 years, 10 years away from when people will just say, yes, it's a software, it has problems?
We are kind of that way with Windows, but Windows is like really, it's pretty boring now, right?
Yeah.
I mean, now we've had the lights go out twice in Ukraine because of cyber attacks, right? That's a fact. So people are really concerned about that, and I imagine we're going to have lights go out again somewhere at some point, and maybe when that becomes really routine, then people won't want to hear about the vulnerabilities because they'll just assume that they're there. Sort of like with the credit card hacks. I mean, we did that. We had like a run of a couple years where, you know, every time there was a credit card hack, you know, this retailer or that, it was a big story. And now they happen and we barely even pay attention to them. And speaking of Patch Tuesday, we just had a Patch Tuesday where I believe Spectre and Meltdown were patched, and we didn't even really mention that the patches had come out that day. I'm sure some press covered it, but it wasn't a big deal anymore.
Yeah.
What we do with the Windows Patch Tuesday is, when we started 12 years ago, we would try to cover Patch Tuesday as an event, and we found that didn't actually excite readers very much. Yeah. So we started just picking and choosing, you know, what are the key patches here? What's the most critical one? What's one that's has an exploit in the wild? So that's how we usually focus on it. So the last one, Spectre or Meltdown, was obviously our angle, although that had sort of come out the week before anyway, so we knew it was coming. Yeah. But we try to focus on, you know, the more crucial patches and not the whole Patch Tuesday thing.
So just to circle, and those are good examples, and I think identification theft and other things. Now ransomware is hot, but we probably won't read as much about ransomware in 3 years, even if it's more prevalent. So you think it's still going to be around for a while, this interest in the readers, both cybersecurity in general, in the physical device type of hacks that we're seeing? I mean, if I were to put you on the spot and say 3 years from now, do you think you'll be writing more or less articles on the hack du jour causing or potentially causing an impact in an elevator or a refrigerator or something like that?
Are you talking research-based or actual events?
Let's stick on the vulnerability, the okay. Potential.
Okay. I mean, I think there's always going to be new ways of breaking things and new things to get broken. So I kind of think we will be. I mean,
still be covered?
I think we will.
How about you,
but
yeah, absolutely. And I think what it comes down to, you use the big word impact. Yeah. What is the impact? So when there's, you know, more research saying, you know, it's like the 15th one that says this is vulnerable, we're probably not going to be covering that. But when it has impact, whether the impact means that you know, machines are hacked or stop working, or if the impact is that a company has to you know, do an expensive recall. Think of the Fiat Chrysler recall, right? That was the first time that had happened, but there are going to be more car recalls, and we're going to cover them until it becomes so routine that, you know, people just kind of go to the car company's website and download the latest patch.
One thing to add to what you're asking, I think is a good example, is the recent AWS misconfigurations that we've seen exposing data online. We had so many of those stories in a matter of 3 weeks that we were like, oh, another one. So what we try to do is, one of the things, dark reading, what we try to do to set us apart is we like to do more analysis in our stories rather than just, we do some straight news. We have various types of stories, but our bread and butter are the news analysis pieces where we dig into the trend, what this really means, things you may not know about it. So we try to take that story, for example, take it to the next level and talk about why people are misconfiguring these things. This is a problem. These are examples of it. Not every single time it's been exposed is that a big news story now. The first couple probably were, right? But now it's like, okay, now what do we do about it? Why is this happening? So that's kind of where we take those kind of stories that seem passé after a while. Even with ransomware, we've gotten to that point where it's like, oh, another ransomware thing. But you still need to cover it, but then you want to take it to the next level about, you know, how do we fix this? What are we doing wrong? What are the solutions out there? That kind of thing. That's where we try to push it at that point.
And another thing that we try to do, you mentioned those AWS data being exposed. We sort of look at where the research is coming from. And is the research coming from a company that does consulting to help you so your data isn't exposed?
Right.
We might still cover it, but if that company keeps putting out very similar things, then it's sort of like, well, this is really you know, becoming marketing.
Right.
Right. So we even look at how the information is being given to us. Is it from marketing people or researchers? What kind of you know, who are the researchers? What are their experience? Do they really know what they're talking about? Or again, is it just, you know, like flavor of the hack of the day or vulnerability of the day? But I got a question for you, which was you said you're interested in vulnerabilities and attacks. What are the categories of stories that you think are being undercovered?
Well, I think trend stories, trends in the industry. you know, where we're making progress, where we're not making progress, the way that asset owners and vendors are approaching this problem. I mean, I've been trying to pitch for a long time. I've been so pleasantly surprised that there's been a lot of security added to these level 1 devices. You know, this is a passion of mine with Project Basecamp, and that we had Insecure by Design. We're finally solving that problem. So to me, a major story is we're solving this problem that's been there for a long time, and now the question is, when will asset owners actually start deploying and upgrading these systems? You know, so to me, those kinds of stories are being underreported, or stories where we've been talking about the same thing for 5 years and making no progress. Why is that? So those are harder stories, and I want to actually talk to you a little bit about the time you have to write a story. But let's stick on the vulnerability just a little bit more, kind of flip the table here, because one of the good things about being here is you learn a lot about the industry. You also get known to all the researchers and vendors, and one of the strategies we see now for a lot of the new vendors selling security products is, hey, we find a vulnerability, we give it a name, we get to the press, you know, we get a couple people to write about it, it gets picked up everywhere else, and we're all of a sudden, you know, that's a lot better than a lot of paid marketing. And in some cases, we've actually seen examples where the companies created the malware themselves, you know, proof of concept malware, and they can show you how this thing can happen. We've seen places where people have greatly overestimated what the impact is. You're not ICS engineers and you're not full-time security professionals. How do you decide? You get this call that someone says, I found this vulnerability, it's real important, I'm going to give you a scoop on it, Kelly. How do you decide whether to run with that or not?
Well, first off, we get a lot of those kind of things, and we don't write about them all.
I would imagine, yeah.
And this has been a trend in the IT security space for years, is that more and more companies have the research teams. They want to get their word, they get their name out there via the research team. So we know that, we get that, right? But we also are really interested in what they're learning, what they're finding. So typically, if we get a pitch like that, you know, we obviously want to interview them, dig in more about what happened, what they found, and try to vet it with other people who are experts in the field, like you and other people we check in with and say, what do you think of this? And then decide whether, you know, we should be writing about it. We try to look, it's hard because there's a lot coming at us sometimes, and you know, we try to pick the things that we think are that resonate the most, that may be most beneficial to our readers. So it kind of really depends, but there's some vetting involved, absolutely.
So my process is the same as Kelly's. I'll just add a couple things. I imagine you may agree with them. So if it's a vulnerability in a product, we ask, well, have you spoken to the company or entity whose product it is? What, you know, when did you, you know, what kind of disclosure was involved? Kind of to get a sense of why they're doing it. If they're rushing it out, I'll say, well, why are you rushing this out? You know, if there's no patch, no solution, like what do you think the good is? And sometimes, and I mean, we get hundreds of these pitches a year, maybe even in a month, dozens of them. You know, so most of them we don't write about. I'd say the vast majority. Then you have something like Spectre and Meltdown, and immediately it's just so clear that this is really important.
Yeah. Some of them just speak for themselves.
Yeah.
So that was a no-brainer.
So that one, I think the chip companies were not so forthcoming, but because of what the vulnerabilities were, who was involved, because of the process that they had put in for disclosure and everything, we covered it like a major story right out of the gate.
Yeah. And we're still covering it.
Yeah. Well,
it's a lot of fallout.
Those are the easy ones.
Right.
I think it's these other ones where it's less clear and less people know about it, that it's a little tougher.
True.
So yeah, let's talk a little bit about your process. So I'm really curious, and I know, Kelly, you have writers. Jim, do you have writers that report to you as well, or do you?
I work with reporters. I'm an editor now, so I do reporting and
so you do some writing and reporting. Yeah. So for both of you, how much time do you get to write for a story, typically? I'm sure there's a range, but if you were to, you know, say an average story, we have how many hours or how many days to research and write that story? And Jim,
I'll start. Yeah, so Reuters, because of we're writing for financial professionals, we're a real-time news service, and when there's news, we send out headlines. I think they're like, you know, maybe the size of what a tweet used to be. that many characters. And we get the information out immediately. We get a story out usually within 5 minutes, a second story out within, say, 15 minutes if it's a big story, and then we take it from there. So we're kind of publishing as we go. If we learn about something and it's either exclusive or there's an embargo, then we have time and we might spend a couple hours or a day on a typical story, and those stories would be 400 or 500 words. And then we have sort of the features, and those we could spend days or weeks or months on, depending. And those are the ones I think that are most distinctive and really help us stand out. So we put a lot of effort into those stories.
So just a question on the feature before you go forward. So if you have some, let's say you or one of your writers says, this I think would make a good feature, but it's going to take me, over the next 2 weeks, half my time to write this. Do you have the ability to pick that, or do you have to go to somebody and say, I think this would be good for Reuters for us to do this?
It sort of depends on how much effort in the situation, but usually, we can determine, as the cyber group, if we think a story is worth investing the time. And then if we wanted to do a longer story, we would need to pitch it to more senior editors. And those editors, what they do is they look at the story, and they don't necessarily understand cyber, but they understand how we can take that story and frame it for the Reuters, one of the Reuters audiences, or for everybody. We want it to be accessible to everybody, and if we're going to spend days or weeks or months on a story, we want to make sure that it's going to have high impact.
How about your process?
Similar. We have basically 4 types of stories on dark reading. I'm not counting our contributed commentary, which is another animal, but we have a whole section where we get contributed commentary from industry experts. That's a separate piece. We have something called quick hits, where if it's like original reporting, say Jim had, that I'm not going to be able to verify, I might do a quick 3 graphs linked to Jim's story and give Reuters credit. Those are called quick hits. We do those a couple times a day. And then we have short news stories, which are just like straight stories where you don't really need to go to analysis. You just want to get the news out there. But our bread and butter, again, is the news analysis, which we try to do most of our stories. And that's where you're putting interviews. And sometimes those happen in one day. We turn them around. Sometimes you get a couple extra days. But we're also a daily, even though we're not a daily newspaper, all of our writers write every day. I used to, but now that I'm an editor and I'm managing the news section, I don't get to write every day, but I shoot for 3 stories a week if all goes well. But the goal is to get content every day. We try to have something every day. So we're working on stories in advance that we're planning for the week. We also have feature pieces, which I forgot to mention, and we don't get to do those as much as I'd like, but a similar idea with Jim, you can take time to work on something, as much time as you need if you have a really good idea. I got a couple from this conference this week that I want to do, which I won't be doing this week, obviously, but I'll take my time when I get back and carve out some time to do it. And I would give one of our reporters the same time frame they needed to get it done if it's a good piece.
Is it one of those things where they just find a way while they're doing all those other smaller pieces to work it in, or do they have to actually come and say, I want to do this?
It kind of depends. I mean, there might be a situation where it's like a special report thing where you say, hey, I'm going to give you this time to work on that, but we don't have enough people to do that. We're lean and mean, so that usually you're doing it between other things. That's how I operate too.
Okay. Okay, well, this I know is an area that I think would be valuable for you. Well, I think you'll enjoy talking about, and the audience needs to hear this, is how should you be pitched? So if someone thinks they have a great idea for a story, what are you looking for when they call you or email you, or when you first get on the phone with them to hear it? What's a good pitch, and feel free to say what's a bad pitch too if you have some tips against. And my guess is you guys will go back and forth a little bit on this.
I think we both kind of agree on this. Do you want me to start, or do you want to start?
Yeah, you start.
So the thing that's been happening a lot lately that drives us both nuts, I think, is when we get pitches, like more marketing-oriented pitches for things. And we're not a product publication. We write about product trends and maybe product categories, but we don't cover every product announcement. But we do have a section on our site where we put the press releases for those so that people can find them. We just don't have the resources to be a product publication, nor do we have a testing lab to test products. So I guess our pet peeve is we get pitches sometimes that are not really very interesting, or they're more marketing oriented. And then the thing that I've found lately is that sometimes we'll get a pitch for a great, our researcher found this, and we're like, oh, this sounds great, and we start rolling with the coverage and our research, and then they can't get the person to talk to you. Oh, he's not available today, and you're like, so I guess the main thing I would say, if you're going to pitch a reporter, make sure you have the expert or experts available to talk. That's one of the big things. You think that would be a no-brainer, but that's been happening a lot in the past
Well, that's
year.
funny, and this is the typical, I've been in a small company now for 20 years that I didn't realize this, but you're usually not, oftentimes you're not getting pitched by the person with the knowledge. So someone has told him this,
Sometimes, yeah. It
told him
depends
or
on
her
the-
this, and then they come to you.
I just gave a generalization of the more of them we get are probably PR/marketing type pitches, but we still talk to research directly as well.
Sure.
But I think the majority now, because a lot of companies are growing and they have a marketing department, and that's part of the game. So yeah, it makes it a little bit more challenging
So you're
for
getting
us.
a lot of product pitches which aren't terribly applicable.
Yeah, I mean, if it's something groundbreaking, absolutely. Like it's not that I've never written about a new product.
Yeah.
It's just that it's hard. I can't go test it, number one. And I have to vet it with other people about, is this really new? What's new about this? You have to get through all that stuff.
Okay.
But what I prefer to do for our publication is for us to write about product categories. That's something I think we try to do, the new categories, like what's happening in this industry, all the startups. We've been touching on that in stories, but I want to do a bigger piece, like looking at what's happening. So that's the kind of story we do in the product side of things. But I'm sure you have more that I'm forgetting about
Sure,
pitches.
yeah, just a couple of random things. One of them is time of day. If it's not a breaking news story that broke in the past hour, then sending a pitch after even 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, late in the afternoon on Friday, or on a weekend in the evening hours, it just gets lost. That's one thing. Another thing is actually a pretty big company recently wanted to comment on Spectre Meltdown, and they offered up their chief marketing officer. That's really a no-no. I think there's maybe 1 or 2 CMOs that I've actually quoted in a story in the past 10 years. It's just, we're interested in having and talking to people who have the technical chops and really know what they're talking about, not somebody who is, whose job is advertising and marketing.
I agree with that as well.
Do you have the same, because it sounds like you have, or maybe I'm wrong, but it sounds like, Jim, you have a little more, the time is a bigger issue with you. Is that also an issue with you, whether it's morning or afternoon?
Yeah, I mean, we're all online, right? So we're just like you, but it's a 24-hour cycle in a lot of ways, but we also have to cut it off at some point, right? Or you'd be working 24 hours, which you could do in this industry, but probably shouldn't do. So yeah, we like to get stories up, a certain number of stories up by a certain time of the day. So timing is an issue, but a lot of times I'll say, we don't have time to work on that today. Let's give it more thought and work on it tomorrow, give it a little buffer. But if it is something super important, we would ideally like to have it earlier in the day. That would be a better story for us, and we'd do a better job on it. So.
How do you deal with it? And I don't know what you'd prefer, but I can imagine a pitch where someone would essentially write the story over the phone for you. Like they would say, this is it, this is why it's important, these are the 4 things, and this is what you should write. Do you like that kind of pitch, or do you prefer maybe just a more informative pitch that says, we found this thing, and then you create the story? I mean, the first one would seem to make your job easier if they do a good job. You may not agree with them.
So, no and yes. We don't want to have other people writing the stories for us. And if something looks like that, it's kind of a turnoff. But I think you make a good point. So I just want to step back for a minute and talk about the pitches that we do internally, whether it's a reporter having an informal conversation with me or me pitching, a special report that's going to take months. They ask us, and we always think about, what is the reveal? What is this story going to say that hasn't been said before? What else has been said about it? Why should somebody read my story when there's just so much for them to read, whether it be news or it be their, check-in on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. So we really we're fighting for people's attention. So I think it's a good idea to say, I have this person, this person worked in the government and did this at ICS and really knows what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. Here's their point of view, and here's how it's new or different, right? Not sort of the worst practice would be like, would you like to speak to somebody from company X? It's like, wow, no. Right? And I mean, and I'm getting hundreds of emails a day, and dozens of them are pitches. And I used to respond to every one of them, and I stopped doing that, especially the ones where I don't feel like the people are taking the time to kind of look at what Reuters does, what I do, or why we might be interested.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with everything Jim said, and just to add to that, a lot of times we get these out of the blue pitches to speak with someone who's an expert, has a great background, and you decide to meet them on the phone and talk to them or whatever, and you had this idea of what they're going to talk about, and the PR pitch was completely not what you thought you were going to talk to them about. So the idea, like Jim was saying, let's have some context for who this person is, what they can talk about, and why we should even be meeting them. You know, because I get hundreds a day. Like I don't remember the last time I respond to all my emails. I mean, it's not personal to anyone that emails. I just can't. I would spend all day doing that. So basically, we have to pick and choose. I don't have time for briefings all day long. You know, it has to be very specific to what I'm working on or something I'm looking at. So ideally, we know who the person is. I definitely don't want a pitch telling me what to write about, and that would not be okay. But I also like to hear, like, from if it's a researcher or a technical person who has something they're thinking about and that no one else has been talking about. I want to hear why they think this is a cool thing you should be looking at. I definitely want to hear that. Okay. So it kind of depends.
Yeah. Okay. And it's funny when you're talking about the contact. It seemed to me over the last even 3 years, it's easier to get in touch with reporters almost now through Twitter than certainly through email or phone, at least, to get, you know, a quick ping back. Are you finding, you don't have to tell us the best way to reach you, but if you want, but for reporters in general, what's the best way to reach out to them now in this world?
I think it depends on the reporter. I mean, there are some reporters who almost work exclusively through Twitter, through DMs. And then there are reporters who like to work through email or phone. I actually, maybe it's because of my age, but I still like to talk on the phone. And if somebody calls and they're like really succinct and they know what they're talking about and they have that kind of pitch down, like this is why you want to talk to my person and this is what they can tell you and it's relevant, then that could be a really effective way to reach me.
Okay.
So true confession, I don't answer my phone unless I know someone's calling me that I'm waiting for a call for. Okay. I literally get dozens of phone calls a day on pitches, and I would spend all day doing that. Yeah. So voicemail is not a great way to reach me. I do talk on the phone, obviously, but I just don't have time to answer phone calls. So email for me is the best, and DMs. Yeah. Definitely not tweeting at me, hey, why aren't you? Yeah. We've seen those. Those don't go well. So DM is good, and some people I have text-based relationships with. That's good.
Yeah.
So,
okay. I know one thing you wanted to talk about, and I think it's important, is the concept of, you know, because you have a lot of potential sources out here of off-the-record or background conversations. So, Kelly, do you like those conversations? What are the rules around those? How do you treat those?
Well, I mean, every reporter would prefer to have things on the record. I mean, that's your first choice. But we also know that there's a lot of sensitivity in our industry, especially this sector of the industry, so we appreciate that, and I'm willing to talk to people off the record. We also have to define what off the record means for people. So there's several ways you can look at it. You can have off the record, like totally for background, don't publish it. You know, there's different terms people use for that, and that's fine if it's a situation we really have to do that. And then some people don't want to be quoted directly. They just might want to say I'm with a utility or whatever, and that's okay. But I always like to, and I'm sure you do this too up front, define what that means. If it's not on the record, how are we going to do this interview, and how do you want to present the information? But I mean, ideally, we want to quote people because that gives a story more credibility. And you know, if you have all anonymous sources, that's kind of frustrating. But that sometimes I think we understand why, because some people aren't allowed to speak on behalf of their company. So yeah, I mean, I'm open to that, is what I'm saying. So you know, but of course, every reporter would tell you we prefer on the record if we can. But.
Do you have any, just before we go to Jim, do you, I guess, I don't know if you do enough in just this sector, but I'm kind of curious if there's any sort of percentage of conversations. Do you do like a third on the record and 2/3 off, or what's typically the blend on that?
It kind of depends. Maybe a quarter off, I would say.
So much more on the record.
Yeah, now. I mean, I think of a few years ago, early on, it was probably much more off. I think people are getting want to be a little bit more visible now. Okay. I mean, ideally, we'd like to talk to more asset owners.
Yeah, they're the ones that are, I'm sure it's not a problem getting vendors on the record.
Absolutely.
Well, I shouldn't say that, but especially the smaller ones trying to make a name for themselves.
Mm-hmm. We like to talk to people who are in the trenches, you know, what they're experiencing, the reality check for all the other stuff that we're getting thrown at us.
Okay. So. Jim, how do you treat that? Any differences?
Exactly the same. And I would just say that I think it's essential for us and for the people we're talking to when we say we're going to talk off the record on background, deep background, whatever term we use, to define it immediately and make sure that everybody is clear and agrees to that. I think a lot of times I have people say, oh, this is off the record, and then they just start talking, and I'm like, hold on.
What do you mean
What
by
does
that?
that mean? How can I use it? Because if I can't use it at all, I don't want to have the conversation. And sort of the worst possible situation for a reporter would be to have somebody tell them something that the person who told them thought they could never report ever. And of course, there are different ways to get information.
Yep.
So I don't think that any of us would agree to that, but I think sometimes people on the other end think that that's a possibility, and it's basically not.
How do you deal with because I've had this in talking to reporters where, most of it is quotable on the record, but then the reporter wants to ask a question. I mean, do you actually do this whole off the record, background only, attributed as at various parts of the conversation, or do you treat it as a whole? This conversation is either this way or that way.
I'm sure this is the same for you too. Some conversations are a little bit of both. That sometimes it'll happen. Someone will say, well, this part I want off the record, don't quote me on this, but they'll give you some other insight that they can't tell you on the record. And yeah, I mean, that happens sometimes.
Yeah, that always makes me nervous because I think even with the best of intentions, that kind of conversation could get misconstrued.
Well, yeah,
unless people are recording things. If everyone's just taking notes, that would be difficult.
Well, and I think Jim brought this up too. You set the ground rules of what that means and define it. Say, okay, that part, we're done with the part that's off the record. Now we're back on the record. Like, you have to kind of do that along the way in the interview to make sure that doesn't get confused.
Do you record your interviews typically?
I typically do not.
Okay.
At live events, I do sometimes because I'm trying to be more mobile. So,
Right.
But at home, I don't. At my home office, I do not. Yeah.
Okay.
And I just want to say, you brought up an interesting issue. So there is sort of this situation where, say, the power went out in a utility, right? Acme utility. And I call them up and say, was this a hack? Or what happened? No comment, right? Then they say, off the record, and then they tell me a bunch of stuff, right? If they do that, I will not say that this person declined comment and then put in the off-the-record stuff. If you're kind of the subject of something that's going on, you can have it one way or the other, but you can't have it both because it's misleading to the reader.
That's a good
and
point.
we could also be manipulated.
Yep.
Yeah. No, you guys really, I definitely, that's something I learned right now is because I've had these conversations with reporters and I have talked openly and then I'm going to tell them something that's off the record and I've just kind of casually said, so this is off the record and then going on, I probably need to be a little more structured in that, right? I probably need to get okay, we agree this is off the record.
And what that means.
I've never been burnt by it, but I know I've been casual and that might have been putting the reporter at a disadvantage.
Well, I think it's about building trust, and just from knowing you over the years, Dale, I don't think you just talk to any reporter and kind of say random things. So I'm guessing you've built up trust with these people, and they've deserved it, right? But if you meet a new reporter and you do that, you have a conversation and say this is off the record, and then go back and forth. It could have a really an unanticipated result. So you need to be careful. The person who's being interviewed needs to know the reporter and feel that they can trust them, and the other way as well.
I've had a couple stories, not recently, but over the past that were very sensitive, and we had the on-off record thing, and I went back and double-checked just because I got paranoid that in my notes, is this really the off-the-record part? And I think people appreciate that too.
Yeah, I think you've even done that with me, and that is always helpful. And you're right, Jim, you do have to be careful who you talk to because it's funny, I didn't get a call from either one of you, you might have done it, but in this latest Triton Trisys thing, I was amazed at the amount of calls I got with reporters asking, who was it that was hit? We want to know, who did it and who was hit. And I would say, I don't know. And then they would say, who do you think it was? Which made me really nervous because I was afraid if I answered that question, even off the record, that would be confirmation to them. And I really got the sense that the reporters were looking for someone to say a name, and then they felt like they could report it, or maybe if they could get 3 industry experts to say. And as the question was asked, it was just, please speculate for me, was essentially the question. How do you, I guess if one of your reporters came to you, Kelly, with that, said, hey, I know who the target of Triton was, and they said, I got 3 industry experts who all think it's the same one. Can you run with that?
It depends on how you couch it. We all know attribution's hard, and it's risky because, as we know, threat actors can pose as another threat actor, and there can be layers of an attack. So, and most vendors don't come out and say who they think it is anymore. There was a time when they did, and the IT security side of things, they really don't that much anymore. Sometimes what we'll do is, that's not the lead of the story that it was Russia or China. But in the story, if you get like 3 different people talking about, we think this came out of this region, we'd say, well, you'd couch it that way. This came out of this region, it's likely, but no one's sure. We always couch it as there's no definitive answer that it's from this particular threat actor. I think you have to do that because it's getting more and more difficult, I think, for attribution in general.
So I'll tell you, in that case, I think people said region and country. So what I did was I reached out to my colleagues in that region and country, and they asked a lot of questions. And I can't remember, I think they were kind of maybe, I forget if we confirmed it or not, or what we said. But it also depends on who's saying it.
That's a good point, yes.
If it's somebody who works at one of the biggest cyber intel companies or is linked to the NSA or whatever, then, maybe, what they're saying is credible. But if it's some guy, who works out of their home office and is a consultant, then
easy.
No. No, but that is a good point. Yeah,
just
no,
kidding.
you may work out of a home office, but you are out in the
I'm
field and
just
have
kidding, don't
customers,
worry.
right? That's what I'm talking about.
That's a good caveat. The sources, I didn't even think about that. That's a good point, is you have to know who it's coming from, too. And that's a lot of your reporting is based on who told you something, not just any random person telling you something.
Yeah, I think that's really tough, and I don't know what I would do in your shoes, because there's cases where you could be, like, I could be 90% sure, or even more, 98% sure who it was, but that's just based on interpreting the situation, not based on facts.
Right.
We ran into this with Stuxnet, right? It was a long time before we, quote, knew who did it, and some people still say we didn't, but I think most people would agree we now know. But people had very strong beliefs that it was, the U.S. that was involved in that, but they didn't really know. They didn't have facts. They just had everyone saying, well, let's connect the dots. Who would have the capability? Who would want to do it? And it was pretty obvious.
Well, in some cases, if there's debate over who the threat actor is or the region, you can show both sides of the argument. Like this group thinks it's out of this region because, and this, no, it can't be that because. So we try to do that if we have that as well to balance it out.
And Dale, if you had told me that you thought you knew who it was, my question would have been, why do you think that, or how do you know that? How certain are you? And maybe what I would pull out of that conversation is not you on the record saying that it was so-and-so, but you giving me a tip that I could then share with my colleagues somewhere else, and they could try to follow that through.
But it's a dangerous time for your industry, though, because if you can get, let's say, 3 industry experts to say the same thing, and you can publish it, you're going to get a lot of clicks, right? If you say so-and-so country was the target of, let's say I'll just make something up, the paper industry in Chile was the target of Triton, then that's an article that a lot of people are going to want to read. So there's a motivation if you're going for clicks to do something that's a little less strict to your code.
But I think it speaks to our integrity, and if we keep putting out stories like that, then people are not going to be clicking on them. And it's like this whole fake news phenomenon, right? So I think it's more important than ever for us to be really sure that we believe, what we're writing in, and even if we're attributing it to 3 people by name, if we're not really sure, and I wouldn't write it.
Yeah, you have to feel good about it when you write it. It's sort of a gut check you have too. If it's something you've been covering, you kind of have a feel for some things, and part of it is a gut check, I think.
Okay. Well, I see that we're just out of time, but I want to give you both a chance, both for the audience here and the people that are going to watch the video. Is there anything else you would like to tell the ICS security community about how they can help you do your jobs better?
I guess I would say that, I'd like to have more relationships with people in the community, and that, you have to build relationships. But to build a relationship, you have to start. So for somebody who might be reluctant to speak to me or another reporter, if they think maybe it would be okay, we could kind of start slow, have conversations completely off the record, get to know each other. There are professionals who I speak to who just are kind of like technical advisors to me. And I'll call them up and say, you know, what do you think of this? Does this pass the smell test or whatever? And sort of the more help that I can get from knowledgeable people, the better informed my reporting will be. And you know, I consider that to be really important.
I'll say it again, I'd like to talk to more people in the field, in the trenches, asset owners, even off the record if that's the way they want to do it, but preferably on the record. But I want to learn more about their challenges, the reality of what these vulnerabilities mean to them, right, in their jobs. And then, you know, I've gotten more, over the past couple of years, the big vendors have become more accessible. I remember several years ago trying to get an interview with Siemens was like, you know, pulling teeth, and now like I'm able to talk to them. So things like that, that's an improvement and that's helpful, and the more of that, the better, the more we can talk to the major players.
And if you think we got it wrong, let us know, and let us know why, and let us know what elements you think are missing, and we might write a story about that.
Yeah, we'll tweet that out. Yeah, we really appreciate, you know, the yourselves and the others in the industry that cover this and have been covering this for years. I think you do a really good job on a complex topic, and thank you for coming to S4.
Thanks,
Thank you very much.